Well, I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. My name is Nigel Gilbert, and I'm leading an ESRC, that's the Economic and Social Research Council, funded project about the way in which institutions such as local economic partnerships, combined authorities, and city regions manage the trade-offs between increasing productivity, enhancing inclusivity, and improving sustainability. The LIPSIT project is a joint effort between the universities of Surrey, Birmingham, Cardiff, and Warwick, and Demos, Britain's leading cross-party think tank. We've already published 3 reports, copies of which can be found on our website. Today, we're joined by a distinguished panel to discuss the 3rd of those reports on achieving levelling up. We'll begin with an introduction to the report from Charles Seaford, then ask each member of the panel to give us some brief reactions, and then finally open the discussion to you all. If you'd like to ask questions to the panel, please make use of the Q&A button, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. When the time comes, I'll be selecting questions from there for the panel to answer. Please be aware that we're recording this session. Now, let me introduce Charles, who will be speaking to the report. Charles Seaford leads the Power and Institutions programme at Demos. He was formerly head of the Centre for Wellbeing at the New Economics Foundation and was an advisor at the Sustainable Development Commission. Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I'm going to give a short presentation of the report. So let me now share my screen. Is that working? Is the screen? Yeah, fine, good. So as I say, I'm giving a short presentation of the report. This is a presentation which just in about sort of 10 to 15 minutes. It sets out the conclusions rather than presenting all the evidence. But I think you've all been sent or will be sent a copy of the report, and you can look at that if you want more detail. I won't get into this. Nigel's already explained. This is a joint effort between 4 universities and Demos. What we've done in this report is a response to the fact that regional inequality has got worse since the early 1980s, despite numerous initiatives. And we set out why there is zero chance of reverting this 40-year trend without change, but also we suggest what that change might be like. It's based on a programme of interviews and analysis. We've not shown, some people ask us this, but we've not shown that there's some kind of rule whereby local autonomy means more growth, although in fact we do argue for that. Sorry about that. You didn't hear it. You didn't miss much. So I'll just carry on where I got to. You saw the presentation. The problem is low skills equilibrium in a nutshell. It's not just inequality between regions, it's inequality within regions and pockets of deprivation. And inequality between regions often reflects the fact that some regions have got a lot of these pockets of deprivation in them. Low skills equilibrium is basically a situation where you might have a balance between supply and demand skills, but both are stuck at a low level. And so the challenge, if we're going to deal with levelling up, is to disrupt these equilibria. This is not an impossible task. There are examples of success overseas. And the study, not by us, but by others, has shown there's a formula that these successful attempts to disrupt equilibrium tend to follow. And broadly speaking, they involve working on skill supply and demand at the same time, as well as work on sometimes infrastructure and inward investment. The formula has not really been adopted that widely in the UK. Relative little effort, not no effort, but relatively little effort has gone beyond growth firms and growth sectors. Stimulating demand for higher skills that the low skilled can acquire is neglected. Sometimes it's actually easier for LEPs to meet their targets by attracting low skilled work. So you've got a low skilled area, it's easier just to get low skilled jobs, just any jobs, just in order to get people into work. And we heard a lot about that. And there is some coordination of work on supply and demand in an attempt to lift the level of supply and demand, but it's relatively rare. And the result means that there is often a trade-off between productivity and inclusivity. People have to choose between one or the other to some extent, rather than combining the two, i.e. achieving inclusive growth. Some LEPs have chosen one path, focusing on product. Some LEPs have chosen the other, focusing on more of it, with a greater focus on inclusivity. The various programs that I described, initiatives to address low skills equilibrium, seem to be successful by combining four success factors. Coordination, because there are many levers to be pulled and they need to be pulled in a coordinated way. Local knowledge. It's not good enough just to have the data. By knowledge, I don't just mean understanding the economic data, but actually understanding the people. So you know what can be done and what can't be done. What you have to do to persuade people to change the way they behave. Because ultimately, what we're talking about here is a program of coordinated behavior change. And that depends not just on the knowledge, but also on the partnership working that builds upon that knowledge. And underpinning that, strong accountability, which forms a driver for the kind of collective action and partnership I've just described. And accountability doesn't just mean voting, incidentally. It could also mean better performance management systems and better participation. But the current system in England discourages these. Coordination requires implementation of a coherent strategy, but the system doesn't encourage coherent strategy. Local knowledge requires decisions by people on the ground. But again, the system doesn't encourage that, which makes partnership working difficult. And accountability that might underpin all this is either non-existent or at best confused. Who is responsible for what? Almost nobody knows, including those who are actually in the system, not just outsiders. And the reason the system discourages these, we believe, on the basis of our report, are three structural problems. Absent or confused decision rights, lack of local accountability, not just electoral accountability, and lack of capability. And those three structural problems undermine the success factors. So what we're saying, or what I've said so far, is that what we need to do is address those structural problems. And once we've addressed those structural problems, we can create the success factors, which lead to the successful programs which disrupt low skills equilibria, which in turn results in leveling up. So we're not saying that's the sufficient condition. We probably need more money, we need other things as well, but we're saying it's a necessary condition. It's a necessary part of what has to happen if leveling up is to be successful. So what do we recommend? How do we address those problems? We think, on the basis of the conversations we've had, that there are three approaches to this. Fine-grained improvements to the system. A little tweak here, a little tweak there, a commission here, this, that, the other, blah, 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 blah. We think that's a laborious Sisyphus, and you will never roll a stone to the top of the hill. This is basically the approach that's been adopted for the last 40 years. So why you think that this is going to work now, I can't imagine. But it's still, we hear a lot of this. You know, we can do this, we can do that, we can do the other. We could adopt increased centralization, essentially, and not quite, but essentially going back to the RDAs and government offices for the regions. So you basically create strong, but essentially government, well, centralized agencies which run the whole thing. Or you could create strong local institutions. That is to say, institutions with, just referring back to those three problems, clearer decision rights, greater accountability, and stronger capability. And it's probably no surprise that we recommend the third, and which we think is more ingrained with where things are going at the moment, potentially could go at the moment. So I just want to go quickly through what those three things mean. When we say strong local institutions, we don't mean that central government doesn't have a role. Strong local institutions require Whitehall leadership as opposed to micromanagement, because there are national objectives and programs. I mean, like this morning, the government's program for the Green Industrial Revolution, clearly that is part of the mix. And that will require coordination and guidance of local and regional programs. However, the problem is that Whitehall controls now, it exercises its control through funding competitions, direct funding and some regulation. And we are proposing a different process, a process essentially of negotiation or strategic conversation, if you like, in which objectives are agreed by the authorities in Whitehall. And then on that basis, funding is set. Just an example, I was really struck in our research to find that although the people we were speaking to had local carbon targets, it was totally unrelated to the national carbon budget process, and there was no coordination. So, which was really, or so they told me, which is really, really peculiar. But coordination is possible, and it does take place overseas. So, agreeing objectives through negotiation. I mean, just a little bit of more detail on this because we believe it's quite crucial. The authority will develop its objectives for its regional economy. On the basis of this, it bids for a single pot grant. Now, government has national objectives. So if, looking across the country, those national objectives are not met, we can go back to those who are best placed to up their game and explain the need publicly, what is needed, so that everyone, there's no kind of untoward, nothing untoward, and then negotiate them up and find the easiest way to get to where it's needed to get, the economy needs to get to. Similarly, with the sum of bids is greater than the amount available, which it almost certainly will be. They can have a negotiation, just as there is in Whitehall. But the end of the negotiation should be an agreed set of targets and budgets. And this this process would require some rationalisation within Whitehall, so there's a single interlocutor, and some rationalisation of the division of labour locally. And we go into a little bit of that, illustrative ideas on that in the report. Then accountability builds on this and uses branding. And we think that levelling up and the devolution associated with it would benefit from branding that creates expectations and builds support. Branding is a kind of commitment device in the commercial world, and I think this process needs a commitment device from government, and that's what a brand would do. And if you think about those pieces of policy that really lasted and really had a big impact, like the old age pension or the National Health Service, they've had really strong brands. And we think that would be an important part of communicating this and creating the accountability that's necessary. Then local institutions, local authorities could use this to improve the way they engage with citizens, building on best practice. And formal accountability can be very straightforwardly built upon that, built on the objective setting process and associated KPIs. And all that should be publicised in an accessible way. Capability needs to be built up, but it's a fairly straightforward problem in a way. I mean, it requires hard work, but it's not impossible. You create the conditions for recruiting talent by signalling this process. This is really happening. You ensure that you have institutions that are large enough to have or recruit the core leadership, and you build out from there. You set high standards and expectations, and you may want two-way secondments. It's not because central government's got all the answers or local government's got all the answers, but two-way secondments would help, I think, in building up capability. And then you improve data, the data that's provided in the analysis, including better standards of evaluation, which is widely criticised. So, on the basis of that, we've got an 8-point plan, which I'm not going to read out, but we basically think a step-by-step plan is perfectly feasible I've highlighted step 4 because that was the point about setting shared objectives, which is the sort of centerpiece of this. But all the other parts of it are important as well, and more detail, of course, in the report. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Charles. That's really helpful as an introduction to the report. And as we've said, that report is available either on our website or in your email. I'd like to move now on to welcoming Lord O'Neill, Jim O'Neill. Jim is the Vice Chair of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. And since leaving government in September 2016, where he was Commercial Secretary to the Treasury. He's now on the crossbenches of the House of Lords. And previous to that, he chaired the city's Growth Commission in the UK, and was one of the people who originated the whole concept of the Northern Powerhouse. So he's a perfect person to pull our report to pieces and tell us where we got it all wrong. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Nigel. As I'll say to everybody else, as I jokingly said before we started, starting this off and following on with a fellow product of the University of Surrey, how could I afford to disagree at all, given that that wonderful institution were daft enough to give me a PhD a few decades ago. Let me also add in the same jovial spirit in the wonders of modern technology. I managed to stay pretty much plugged into what Charles said, even though I voted remotely in a division in the House of Lords about 6 minutes ago. So rather pleased with myself for doing that. I just hope I voted the way I intended to, which I won't find out till later. Let me make 4 quick points. First of all, I congratulate Charles and the team and yourself, Nigel, on not only a very thorough and clearly well-researched report. Given my odd position in this space, I get dragged into, or many people try to drag me into numerous versions of an event like this. But I try to say no to many of them politely. But one of the reasons why I agreed to this is when I read it, I thought it was had some additional insights, not least in both the scale of its necessary ambition and its clarity. And I congratulate you guys for that. Second thing to say, and why I particularly started out with that, trying to solve these enormous challenges for the UK is not easy. You know, some of the regional challenges of the UK, in fact, the core parts of them have sound rationale from economic forces of the past 50 or 60 years going on around the world. And trying to reverse them is not something you can just do with superficial attention. And in the spirit of how we did the Cities Growth Commission some 6 years back, this is why I think the kind of things that you are suggesting are the kind of important ideas that are definitely worthy of pursuit. Third thing to say in that regard, I particularly welcome the latter parts of what Charles summarized that fed into your recommendations about the whole regional issue, and I think it's timely. From my own awareness, this government, through its own very, so far, peculiar stance on levelling up, in that it talks about it endlessly, but seemingly finds it difficult to actually do anything. Obviously, the pandemic gives some reason for distraction, but it certainly doesn't suggest they shouldn't be taking it more seriously, given how much they've talked about it. And I say that because I'm aware that they have flirted with the idea of what are they're calling regional growth boards, to make them probably distinct from the RDAs of the past. And it's something which I think is, as a principal way to approach this around particularly the North, the Midlands and the Southwest, is a pretty sensible approach. But of course, it would depend on all sorts of details that went with it, of which this report articulates some very sensible ideas, in my view. And along with that, the fourth thing I would say, which I don't think I picked up specifically from what Charles has presented, but maybe it is buried in the report. I am a strong advocate as a consequence of never letting a crisis go into waste, the one we are in, that just as the UK, if it's going to be serious about net zero emissions by 2030, needs to have more government-backed, what I would call patient capital in terms of achieving those goals, it should do so to execute many of the goals that are expressed in this report. Some kind of domestic version of a sovereign wealth fund or a conditional patient capital entity, which would be at arm's length on a regional basis, but with its mandate set by central government along the lines of what was put out in this report. So I'll stop there and thank you for including me in my brief time and the subsequent discussion that will follow.
Great, thank you ever so much. That's raised some interesting points. And can I just remind people that do put some questions into the Q&A panel. So I'd like to move on now to Professor Donna Hall. Donna has been described, it says, as a public service pioneer by Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester. She was the CEO of Wigan Council for 8 years and developed the Wigan Deal and relationship with residents, which delivered £160 million of savings and improved services and resident satisfaction. She's the chair of the new local government network and chair of Bolton NHS Foundation, both of which are really important roles. So Donna, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nigel. And I really completely agree with everything that Jim's just said. Going back to the report and Charles's presentation, I think I'm just wondering whether the title's right of the report. First of all, I think it's fantastic. Well done. It's a great piece of work, as Jim said, and really thorough and absolutely spot on in those 8 recommendations. But I'm wondering whether it is about structures and processes for levelling up, or whether it's actually about a complete mindset shift. Going back to what Charles said about coordinated behaviour change, I think that coordinated behaviour change starts with trust between central and local organisations, and not forgetting that we already live in the most centralised state, or one of the most centralised states in the whole world. And it seems to, since March, since COVID hit everybody, it seems to have got much more like that, much more command and control, certainly within the NHS organisation that I'm a part of, and with local government as well. So I do think there does need to be a shift in that whole mindset and relationship, and setting up much more of a kind of federal type structure like they have in Germany and other countries, which have been much more effective in terms of managing the effects of the pandemic. We've seen with things like test and trace, where completely ignoring the local infrastructure of what happens in local government, what happens in combined authorities, and setting up something that duplicates that doesn't work. It's not effective. You're not in touch with local populations and with local economies. So I think the fact that on the first page it says management from the centre is dysfunctional, I went, yes, because it is. It just doesn't work. It's not a political point. It's a practical point. So something around the behaviours and the relationship and the mindset earlier on, I think would be helpful, because it does sound quite technical. It isn't for me just around systems, structures and processes. It's about how people treat each other in running economies and in running public service systems. I really do agree with the point about the capacity at the local level, though. I mean, we saw Croydon the other day issue a 114 notice, basically saying that they have no money. We've seen the same in Northampton, and we're as the network New Local, we're seeing many of our 70 members start to really panic about they've used all their reserves, they have no more money left, they've spent money and they've not got the income that they would have had if we hadn't have had COVID-19, and they are really, really struggling. So I think Croydon will be the first of many councils that declares themselves bankrupt in the next few months. I completely agree with Whitehall providing leadership and not management. That's critical. The micromanagement of targets that we have on the economy and health and everything else. And that focuses the people on the wrong things, on short-term targets. And again, we've had more than 400 different funding streams for economic development in the last 2 years that individual teams within councils, within combined authorities, within LEPs have been struggling to keep filling in the application forms and get people ready for the beauty contest that will then tell people whether they've got the money or they've not got the money. It's such a waste of our capacity. And I think the 8-step plan that's set out here in the recommendations will provide that clarity of leadership, that purpose, that definition of what we're here to do, and the division between central and local, so that we're all able to develop a longer term plan together around an economic recovery framework for everywhere. And you can see, I think, the way that Greater Manchester's done that, thanks to the people at the vanguard of that, like Jim and Howard Bernstein and others, who were really pushing to get that kind of local autonomy. And you've seen again, mayors, you might regret creating the whole mayoral structures, but I do think the role that Andy Burnham's played in Greater Manchester in the management of the pandemic has been exemplary. He's stood up for the people, and he's, in Greater Manchester, we've developed our own test and trace system. We've brought in a lot more capacity than has happened at the national level, because it's much more a population focused response. And similarly with the economy as well, lots more bespoke stuff happening in the Greater Manchester area and through the LEP. Just the one thing that I would add just very briefly at the end that I think might be something to consider for the future, not for this report, but the whole idea of community wealth building, that the Preston model, the whole idea of involving communities. It says at the end, kind of tell communities, communicate with communities, which seems to me a bit top down. I think it should be much more about listening to communities, involving them, and also linking in with the new emerging structures that are going to be coming out from NHS England shortly, which is integrated care systems, which again will be at the local level, but trying to combine, because we know the intrinsic links between health and the economy. We saw that in Greater Manchester with the health and social care devolution ask, and we got 500 million to deliver that. But the links between health and the economy are absolutely critical. So don't do the two things separately. Don't let's set up a structure for the economy and a structure for health. They need to come together at the local level. But it's a great report. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. That's really inspiring in some ways. Yes, and I very much agree about your point about trust. That's great. Now I want to move on swiftly to Jamie Driscoll. Jamie is the Mayor of North of Tyne. Previously to becoming Mayor, he was a Labour and Cooperative Councillor in the Monument Ward in Newcastle City Centre. So, Jamie, some reactions.
Thanks, Nigel. And I guess I'm one of the people who actually has to do this and not talk about it. So there's some very good stuff in this report, and hats off for challenging this narrative and recognizing that you can't level up with concrete. It's about people, number one. So structure, necessary, skills necessary, but as Charles said in his introduction, they're not sufficient. And also well done for not trying to solve every problem in a single report, because it would have been too long and no one would have read it. So it's quite good at focusing on the right things there. There is no perfect model, and there is no stable equilibrium in politics or in a society. Sometimes you've just got to get on and do it. Otherwise, we will be having the same conversation in 10 years' time saying, when is someone going to come up with a plan for levelling up? There's the wonderful T.S. Eliot quote, where people are dreaming of systems so perfect that nobody has to be good. There is always a human element in it. You don't get necessarily, we all get to vote, but we don't necessarily get the leaders that each of us would like. So that's where the structures come into it. And one of the advantages of being a mayor, as opposed to a parliamentarian, and Andy said this himself when I've spoken to him about it, who was an MP, and obviously I wasn't. He was a Chief Secretary of the Treasury and I wasn't. But I don't face a shadow mayor across the dispatch box every week trying to tell me why I'm doing it wrong and me trying to make him look foolish. What I do is I convene and get people together and make things happen. So that's why local leadership is important. That's why also, and the report asks this question, I think the accountability absolutely must have a democratic mandate. And that you're talking about building a brand, and it is that personal, right, he's the mayor, it's his fault, and if it goes right, even if I didn't do it, I also get the credit for it. That's the deal. And that's what is necessary in a liberal democracy. Otherwise, forget levelling up. RDAs, all of these things, exactly as you say, they've never worked, they never will work, because they are dependent on the patronage of a specific Secretary of State. And we've seen structures come and go time and time again, as Don has said. So, a couple of points on this then. Interesting parallel evolution. Long before I'd read this report, long before I knew Demos was working on it, I sat down with my team. We've produced a report for what we want for our next Devo deal, because I have the additional disadvantage of, unlike all the other metro mayors, mine only covers half the functional economic area for historical reasons. Jim has the scars of being involved in setting that up from when he was a minister. And it only covers half the transport system, so I don't even have transport powers. So we looked at what we would need, and it has a set of benchmarks in it that we go into government with, and we want zero carbon, zero poverty, and that's it. It shouldn't be either of these things in 10 years' time. You're always going to have relative poverty, inevitably, but there should be zero absolute poverty. No school uniform poverty, no food bank poverty, and no homelessness. All those things can be solved. But we've got benchmarks like, obviously, net new jobs, which I have at the moment, labour productivity, prosperity, including asset ownership, which is one of the key things about levelling up. Most of the people in the Northeast have a fraction of the assets of the people in the Southeast and London, not just property values, but things like financial assets. So that matters. And a whole range of other things, healthy life expectancy, educational qualifications. These are all necessary because it's about people and not concrete. So we've done that. Interesting to note, actually, in terms of centralisation, you won't find a single mayor, Labour or Tory, who will have a good word to say about the Department of Education at the moment, because their latest effort on Boris Johnson's new Life Opportunity Skills Guarantee is that, despite the fact we all have devolved adult education budgets, they've chosen to do it centrally. So there's a difference, exactly as I think it was Jim said, between the rhetoric and the actions at the moment. I would add something to the skills, though. Skills alone won't get us out of this. We do need higher wages. For example, if you think of the job of a cleaner, that's never going to be a high-skilled job. But there's a difference between surviving and getting by on minimum wage and getting the real living wage, which is one of the best ways to level up. So good work pledge that we're doing, many others are doing, embedding that in procurement is part of that element. We're also doing work with the National Innovation Centre for Data, funding projects for how we get the foundational economy more productive, so that they can pay higher wages, because it is a barrier in some of these things. Some political decisions, like do we fund adult social care, but others, hospitality, well, let's just actually try and make these businesses more productive. The other thing I would say is the single pot funding that the report calls for, again, absolutely necessary, but I think not sufficient. Conversations I've had with Jim in the past and others is I don't just want an endless supply of fish. What I want is a fishing rod. So this is things like a regional wealth fund, the ability to borrow at base rate so I can invest in the economy locally, things like land value uplift, so that when we put in a new metro line and that generates massive amounts of wealth, I don't now have to get in an argument with developers about what we can do with it. You just put a charge on it. We can fund these things up front. We don't have to keep going back to central government. We can plan. We can do things, wonderful things like plan on a 25-year horizon. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So the kids who are going to school, we will know what's going to happen to their kids at some point in the future. So there's all of these things, and that involves getting serious people in as well, you know, to get involved in the management of these things. So no plan survives contact with the enemy. You're always operating against a changing political and economic situation. But sometimes you just need to get on and start and work out a lot of these problems as you go. Cheers.
Great. Thanks very much, Jamie. That's inspired a lot of questions in the Q&A, and it's my job to try and select some to get you started. So let me begin with a question that came from Tony Smith, who asked, Do the panelists feel that the government is truly committed to devolution and levelling up? And how can we best make arguments in the current political landscape? Who would like to respond to that from our panel? Can I just point out that you're all on mute at the moment, so you probably want to unmute yourself. So, Jim, do you want to kick off with that?
I'm going to try and count to 10 before I answer. So, you know, you would have thought for a government led by a prime minister that gave his first 2 public speeches in the north of England, and it was all about levelling up and the importance of the Northern Powerhouse. The answer was pretty straightforward, but apparently not. I could spend hours talking about it. I think the complicated reality involves two core, almost philosophical issues. I think the image of levelling up, and within it, the image of the Northern Powerhouse, and its let's call it its sort of branding success, is just highly appealing to the government of the day, especially one that got voted in with the support of some surprising seats around the country, especially in the North and Midlands. And so that in itself attracts them to the concept. And one would imagine that at some point the concept translates into reality, but as is true about so many aspects of our lives, that and the whole interaction of policymaking with our lives, not just on this issue, but it's so relevant, there seems to be in modern life a bit of a gap between the reality of delivering on something and just talking about it. And the second thing I would say, however, is that, and maybe it links to it, in the sort of 24/7 world in which we live, and social media is so important, people are attracted so quickly to quick things and superficial things. That in itself might distract from the real substance of what is needed, and which is partly why a report like this is so welcome. And as I said in my opening comments, you know, trying to deal with the issues that have got the UK to this position of being the most centralised run country in the OECD, along with not many exceptions, the most geographically unequal and disproportionately divided productivity nation. You know, there's big long-term issues that have driven it, and it requires proper, serious attention and not superficial playing.
Jamie, Donna, do you want to add anything to that, or should we move on to another question?
No, just very briefly. Thank you, Nigel. They, on a political level, they would love to level up, but as with, you know, it's like a dog is not just for Christmas, it's for life. As soon as you get the mayors, they then find that, oh, they're hard work, because they don't agree with it, and they have opinions, and they actually seem to know more about their areas than we do, and we're actually in some level quite intimidated by them. So all of these things happen. It's also a mistake to see a government as a monolith. This is, as a Labour mayor, I can tell you there are some pretty good Tory ministers. I can also tell you there's some pretty awful ones. And you know what, if we'd been having this conversation 15 years ago, I'd probably have said the same about the Labour Party. So there are those who are on their game, and I've had conversations with ministers where they've said to me, you know, all this stuff about fiscal innovations, I think it's brilliant. I'm not sure I can get it past so-and-so. And these are the sort of issues we've got to do. And that's why, where the report talks about it, it's why I'm saying you need people with a mandate, is unless you have a power centre, unless someone who can, you know, Donna was referencing Andy, I was doing the same thing in North East down in Sheffield, Stephen Merseyside, unless you can have people who can speak with an authoritative voice because they have the mandate behind them, we will never get levelling up. It cannot come from devolving power to officials in a region. It can only come by the electoral. The reason we've got devolved authorities in Wales and Scotland is because culturally they had a history of having their own governance. Donna,
do you want to very briefly, or shall we move on to something else?
I'm happy to move on, Nigel. I think both of colleagues have answered it really well.
Right, great. Well, the next question that's got lots of votes behind it is, what, if anything, should be the role of research and innovation in supporting levelling up? Donna, do you want to have a go on that one?
Yeah, absolutely critical. I mean, the fact that you universities have got together and done this is fantastic. But yeah, I think research and development, we've got some amazing academics out there coming up with some great work. So absolutely critical, I think.
Anybody want to, this is a bit like motherhood and apple pie, I think. Anybody want to disagree with such a
Yeah, I don't want to disagree, because obviously research and innovation is critical, but I do think it matters what research and innovation. Some research and innovation will only create a very small number of jobs ever, and okay, there's the trickle down effect and there's the second order effects, and that's all fine. But I think when we're thinking about how we want to direct public research and innovation budget, there's some awareness of the regional and jobs impacts. I think this just needs to be it's a factor to bear in mind.
Yeah. That really leads us on to the next question. Do we know which, Paul Hodson asked, do we know which higher skills are good for low-skilled people to learn? He says that he knows that building renovation is on the list. Are there other credible synergies with decarbonisation? I think the link to decarbonisation is actually quite important anyway with all of this debate.
Nigel, can I jump in, and I'll touch on that, but I also want to relate it to the previous question about R&D. This is partly why I said I think it was my fourth comment about some kind of patient capital vehicle done on a regional basis. You know, this is not, this is an endemic problem throughout the whole of my adult lifetime, seemingly, for the UK, that we have 16 of the nationally of the most recognized top 100 universities in the world, which is 4 times our share of global GDP, and yet we have this multi-decade repeated seeming problematical challenge that we rarely manage to develop great ideas coming out of our top universities into sustainable value job creating businesses, by and large, in the country as a whole, with perhaps the exception of London and the Southeast. And in particular, not in the areas often where a lot of these universities are. In the north, there's a vehicle called the N8, which many people don't even know exists, which connects the 8 historically most well-regarded northern universities, most of whom are in that top 100, and yet they're in the middle of some of the lowest productivity parts of the country. And we need something in the spirit of shocking the system, as Charles presented it, to really back with patient capital things coming out of these places to try and create substantive value creating jobs, whether they relate to the green challenge or something else.
Jamie, do you want to say anything on this?
I mean, inevitably, R&D, like you say, motherhood and apple pie, who would disagree with it? I think perhaps the one thing to say is the Golden Triangle, Cambridge, Oxford, London, gets a huge amount of it. It's one of the things we have to change. Is there an easy mechanism to do that beyond central government saying, actually, we're just going to redistribute a bit? Then I think that's one of the things that has to happen. There's also the vehicles for what you do with it. The patient capital that Jim's been talking about is exactly one of the things that I'm talking about. And that's why I say things like, you know, you can't just do it on the basis of give us more money to London every time. You have to say, we want to generate the wealth here. And R&D is a big part of that.
There's a very interesting question that's been put on it, which I'll read out to you. Is on the international development scene, the argument is often made that some countries are rich because others are not. Do you think this is the case for regions within England? I guess it should be more than just England. And do you think it's feasible in our current economic system for everybody to be more wealthy and for society to be more equal?
I think if I can pick that one up, Nigel, I mean, yes, as an abstract, if you're going to look at relative wealth, then you are going to have someone rich and poor. But what we shouldn't have is people sleeping on the streets. What we shouldn't have is people having to go to food banks. What we shouldn't have is people my age now, just turned 50, being laid off due to COVID and economic changes, now thinking, well, what the hell am I going to do for the next 18 years till I qualify for a state pension? So I think it's less the relative issues than the well-being. We've been doing some work with Carnegie and others about benchmarks on this, and that is really one of the things that we should. My current target's GVA, private sector leverage, jobs created, and we're storming all of them way ahead. But that's not the things that actually are going to level us up. The things that they measure tools that get you leveled up, but leveled up is everyone happy?
So I'm going to jump in again, Nigel.
Please do. Yeah.
So I see is it Linda that asked the question? I think it's frankly, I regard that as a bit of very strange evidence she's picking up. From what I can tell, and in my longer past, in my time at Goldman Sachs, I presided over the development of an index for over 180 countries about sustainable economic development. And the best performing countries, and it's pretty consistent with stuff done by the UN and the World Bank, are those countries. These are the wealthiest countries, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them have the most equally shared growth as well. Scandinavian countries being, in particular, good examples, but also the likes of South Korea and some other parts of Asia too.
Donna, do you want to say anything on this?
No, again, I think it's been covered. Let's move on to another question.
So can we use the Kobit experience to make the case that levelling up must be about social infrastructure as well as economic infrastructure? I think it's another one of those questions which the answer is yes, but the question is...
Can I come in on this one, please?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's exposed really stark inequalities, hasn't it? And but they were there before COVID. And let's not forget that our health was getting worse before COVID as well. So healthy life expectancy, the years that you live with good health, in some parts of the country are below the age of 50. So, you know, Jamie would be is steady decline into poor health. So, you know, we've got, and that's down to, you know, lack of investment, underinvestment in public health, underinvestment in community resilience and in things like physical activity. And I think, you know, we need to link all of that in with a different economic model, think about wealth building in terms of health building as well. And try to think about constructing a new normal. We're not going to go back to what we had. It's gone. I know even with a vaccine, I do think there will be a need to develop different ways of working, different economies, different modes of travel, and including the most disadvantaged and our frontline workers. You know, they've been out there, they've been catching COVID. The hospital I chair, we've lost a lot of our staff, and they've mainly been Black and minority ethnic colleagues who've lost their lives, particularly people in frontline roles. So yeah, it's intrinsically linked.
Others? Okay. Well, let me ask a question that is not on the list, but you're all being extremely polite and more or less agreeing with what the report says, with some obviously some differences in emphasis. So my question is, you know, why hasn't the government already done this, and why, you know, how would anybody, you, persuade them to do it? What are the obstacles that you see in actually carrying out this 8-step program?
Yeah, I'll go first, and if you want, Nigel.
No, Jamie,
Please.
Go on, Jamie, go on.
Yeah, cheers. Just on the point that we're all agreeing with it, independently, we've done a body of work that came to very similar conclusions. Bob Kerslake did the 2070 Commission report. We're seeing work coming out of trade unions. We're seeing work coming out of the CBI. When you've got everybody saying the same thing, it is just possible that it's true. And that is one thing I would say about the report. The question then is, why is there always a delay? Well, a huge amount of it is organisational inertia. The process by which you get anything done, you know, if you're talking about this, you need a structure to deliver it. You cannot just will into being levelling up. And so who are you going to pay to do the work? Well, who's going to set the policy? Well, who's going to recruit them? Well, who's going to supervise them? Well, who's going to elect that person or appoint that person? By the time you've done all this, you are in one, it takes a long time. You stick in a Brexit crisis, a rapid series of general elections and the world's greatest ever pandemic in the middle of all of that. And it takes time. So the ways through is you need people who are coalition builders to do it. Which is one of the things we're doing today. And that's why Jim and I are on many of these calls, and I'm sure Donna and Charles are as well. Because that's the only way it's going to happen, is when you get an alignment on it and it ceases to be, no disrespect whatsoever to civil servants, I'm really quite sincere about that, but their job is, computer says no. You know, I have evaluated as a good civil servant against the criteria, and the Green Book says that doesn't work, is why it's not happening. And so it requires the political will to change the infrastructure around these things. So you have regional delivery bodies. I happen to think there is no perfect model and never will be. Mayoral combined authorities are kind of what we got, and you can get there with these models. So let's do that.
Donna, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely, completely agree. And I think it's about linking public service reform in with economic growth. So you've got that blend of reform and growth together with health. And so you're wrapping support around vulnerable communities and supporting them into jobs, into good jobs. So it can't just be one or the other. But I do think it's fundamental constitutional reform that's required to make it happen. And we've got a bit of an opportunity now with super forecasting and high output management is out of the door, isn't it, as compulsory reading for SPADs. So let's start thinking about something different, but it will take a huge leap of faith and huge political courage to do it.
I'll say three things, Nigel, quickly. First of all, and here I'm obviously also going to include reflections of my own experience of going in 17 months as a minister, primarily to do exactly this, and I in that sense, I think I have the position of being the first minister out of what ended up being many to resign after Theresa May became leader, and I say that because the first thing you need is a prime minister that is truly bought into the idea and crucially instructs every single one of the departments that is relevant for levelling up, which in my opinion includes at least 9, and hence why I put in the chat function earlier, here to what Jamie said, especially the Department of Education, that they have no choice but to regard this as a priority rather than just do whatever they personally think themselves. And even under David Cameron and George Osborne, that certainly compared with the two governments that have followed, played at it more. That wasn't the case. Second thing is somehow, and Jamie's touched on it, we need to stop this notion of the sort of national tribe and the whole nonsense often surrounding mayors as being because of the perception of which political colour the subsequent elected mayor might be, and it's ridiculous. It shouldn't matter. It's completely against the whole concept of devolution to obsess about that, but somehow that has to be stopped. And then thirdly, and to some degree, Donna touched on this in the health thing, there's also an attitudinal shift that is necessary amongst our civil servants, as exhibited in Public Health England and the opposition to local test and tracing. If it wouldn't be frankly, for the persuasiveness of the Greater Manchester people and for the risk-taking tendencies of George Osborne, the first Greater Manchester devolution deal wouldn't have happened, because a lot of senior civil servants thought it was just be wasted money. And that is just insanity. And we need to get rid of this mindset.
Quickly then, do you have a direct response to the Treasury or government orthodoxy that competitive funding pots ensure the best projects are supported and that work isn't duplicated across a small area? Asks an anonymous attendee.
I have a very direct response to that, but I'm far too polite to say it here.
Me too. Yeah, I've spent my whole working life on bidding for and trying to deliver these things. You know, going back to the urban programme shows how old I am, and they just don't work. You know, places are the same now. I worked in Odsall when I first started, and Langworthy and Seedley, and they're just the same, if not worse. You know, parts of them. So it doesn't work. It's got to be long term, whole system, whole place, working with people, not doing things to people, and you've got to do it with local elected people and local residents. Individual funding pots, you know, people get really pissed off with us coming in with a pot of funding to a neighbourhood and then buggering off when it's all spent. It's got to be a long-term sustainable shift in the social contract between citizen and state. That's the future. I
think the Treasury might bear in mind the following principle. If you've got a system and everybody involved in the system says it doesn't work, there's just a chance that it doesn't work, and you really ought to take that seriously. Just because you might have this idea. We all have ideas in our head about what is right and what is wrong, but if you listen to other people, they might tell you you've actually got it wrong.
On that note, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to think of one sentence to conclude because our time is up. What is the one message that you'd like us all to take home with us? And let's do it in the same order as we started. So, Jim, would you like to make a concluding statement?
Let's hope this report nudges the Prime Minister a week after the internal shenanigans of number 10 to have a serious refresh in how he approaches this challenge.
We must make sure he gets sent a copy. Jamie.
When unions, think tanks, academics, the CBI, small businesses, local leaders, and even the government's own manifesto says this is a good idea, then it might actually just be a good idea. We need to build a massive coalition around it, cross-party, non-party. It's the only way we can get the north of England into the 21st century.
Good. Donna.
It's brilliant. Keep going. I think the issue for me is that often we do it separately through separate lenses, and it does, as Jamie's just said, it requires a social movement, a coalition of people with a clear brand and identity. You know, a bit like the Northern Powerhouse brand, which was great. You know, but something around this as a social movement with universities across the whole of the UK, think tanks, unions, lobbyists, people working together, or otherwise it's going to be diluted.
Charles, do you want to add a final word too?
Yeah, Donna. Yeah, let's do it.
So the final word is let's do it. As an independent academic, I'm not sure I can go along with that, but I understand the sentiment and applaud you all for it. Thank you very much, everybody. Especially thank you to our panel for an exciting hour or so. To our audience. We had something over 100 people listening into this. Hopefully they enjoyed and got a lot out of it too. And thank you also to the whole of the Ellipsip team who prepared the report. The video of this will be available on the Ellipsip website and on the Demos website shortly. If you want to, anybody else wants to look at it, or you want to review what was said, and the report is widely available, and the web link for that was in the chat window. So thank you very much, everybody, and good night. Have a good night. Bye.